that probably I care about more than any other in this space. We can have the greatest fintechs, and we have some of the greatest fintechs in the UK. We can have innovation, we can have funding, we can have policy, we can have regulation, we can have all of that. But for me, we cannot consider ourselves to be a civilized society if we don't fundamentally, thoroughly, and sustainably deal with financial exclusion and turn that into financial inclusion. And that, as you've already heard, is a subject for the fireside chat and the panel that we're about to embark upon. Why? Because without financial inclusion, yes, there's social waste, there's psychological damage and scarring. But even if you only believe this for economic reasons, which I know you don't, but financial inclusion even makes sense just on the economic. Put the economic, social, and psychological together, and you've got something which every nation, every institution, every city, every community, every individual should care about. That's what we're about today. Much less of me, much more of our fireside and the panel. Delighted to be joined by Pooja from MasterCard. We'll start this off, Pooja. What does financial inclusion mean to MasterCard?
Thanks, Chris. And can I just start by saying thanks to Helen and Open Banking Excellence for giving us the opportunity to talk about this, because it is such an important issue to MasterCard, not only from a business perspective, but also from the value that we add to the countries and markets, including the UK, where we operate. And, you know, for MasterCard, inclusion, both digital and financial, is part of our business. It's sort of, you know, part of the fabric of what we do. And we've got over a decade of experience in trying to bring individuals and businesses into the digital economy. And we made a commitment, a global commitment, to bring 1 billion people into the digital economy by 2025. So, you know, it is so fundamental to everything we do. I'll just start by sort of just reiterating that when we talk about financial inclusion, we have to do that with the understanding that financial inclusion now, in the world we live in today, is linked to digital inclusion. They are inextricably linked. And so when we talk about open banking, open finance innovation, or financial services innovation, including in the digital payment space that supports inclusion, you have to take into account both of these. And I'll just give a couple of statistics to help kind of focus our minds. There are still 1.3 million people in the UK that remain unbanked, and all the great work that the FCA has done on financial services for everyday people brought that to light, either by choice or because they can't access appropriate financial products for them. And even more worryingly, there are still 11 million people that are digitally excluded. So we could have really helpful innovation that helps financial exclusion, but actually, if you don't help those people to be confident and have access to digital data, devices, or the skills, that innovation sort of becomes redundant to a certain extent. And then the other thing I'll just sort of begin by saying is that for MasterCard, when we think of how open banking has and how it can continue to improve financial inclusion, you have to think about it using 2 different lenses. And Helen touched upon this in her introduction, that you've got to look at it from the data lens, so that access to account information, which can help people manage their money, help them to budget, help to open up access to other credit lines for them, as well as compare products and services much more effectively so that they can find the product and service that works best for them. And then there's the payment initiation bit. And for us, it's the data piece and innovation in that space from an open banking, open finance perspective that is going to be the real driver for inclusion, more so than the payment initiation piece.
That's interesting that you rightly highlight digital inclusion and financial inclusion, and I've long been on that that same path. And for a long time, I really believed that we'd need to get digital inclusion before we could really get after financial inclusion. But I'm pretty convinced now that it's financial inclusion, the payment imperative, the fact about how payment influences all of our lives in so many ways, and the other financial elements as well. If we can really get after financial inclusion, that could potentially be the driver more of digital inclusion. So thinking into what's happening in the regulatory space at the moment, there's obviously a lot going on. What are you planning to get stuck into in that regulatory landscape?
Yeah, so I think two things that I touch upon when we're thinking about the future regulatory landscape and policy landscape in the UK. And as we know, the Financial Services and Market Bill is making its way through Parliament as we speak. And I'd just like to sort of make 2 points here. One, going back to that digital and financial inclusion being two sides of the same coin point, I think from a regulatory and policy landscape, it's really important that the financial regulators, so, you know, the PSR, the FCA, when they think about inclusion, they also think about how they can work better with Ofcom to tackle that digital exclusion piece as well. And where, you know, going back to what Helen said at the beginning, where the collaboration piece from a regulatory and policy perspective needs to happen as well. And similarly for us in industry, what can we do with some of those providers of pure digital services outside of digital financial services as well? And then the other point that I'll pick up on is for us, one of the most interesting and important aspects of the future regulatory and policy landscape is going to be that international competitiveness and growth objective that is being proposed to be given to the FCA and the PRA. And these are important because the UK, and sometimes we perhaps don't realize this ourselves, has a very competitive and world-leading fintech, open banking and wider payments industry. And that needs to continue to grow. And for us, that these objectives could be the means, if you like, for regulators and policymakers to really think about what more they can do to champion innovation in digital payments, champion the industry as a means for export, as a means for trade, as a means for growth for the UK, for UK PLC, because there's a real asset here and there's a real positive opportunity here, both for government, but also for the regulators to think about, okay, well, what more can they do under the auspices of the international competitiveness objective to actually be a champion for the industry at the same time as obviously very rightly holding industry to account. And when I think about exporting, you know, some of our world leading fintech and open banking innovation, I think it's really important that we also export the solutions that are driving inclusion. And, you know, again, Helen touched upon this. So it's great that our thinking sort of, you know, aligns that actually there is exclusion at home that needs to be tackled, but we can also really help support financial inclusion in countries with high exclusion rates. And so you're doing well, but you're doing well by doing good, which is obviously one of the kind of key objectives that underlines everything that MasterCard does.
I think that's right. We've done well with the exporting of the FCA sandbox, for example, being taken up by over 50 nations around the world. And many of the businesses, as you know, that went into that sandbox weren't just fintechs, so fintechs involved in financial inclusion. So I think what I'm hearing from you, you're saying all of us collectively and government, we need to sing, shout and holler about this a lot more than we're currently doing.
Yes, I would agree with that.
On which point, MasterCard obviously heavily involved in financial inclusions. Perhaps share with us a couple of examples of some of the organizations, some of the businesses that you're involved with in this space.
Yeah, very happy to. So one of the key things that we're doing is thinking about how we work with and how we support using our expertise, our network, our technology with what we call social purpose fintechs and with partners that are developing products and services that account for faith, for sexual orientation, gender, age, ethnicity, social impact, and other what we call value-based frameworks that actually impact how people live their lives. And I'll give two very quick examples of that. So we partnered with a fintech called Algebra that provides banking based on ethical finance principles, including Islamic finance principles, for example. And so, because when we think about exclusion, it's not necessarily one homogenous group. There are different segments, there are different types of exclusion. That maybe there are products that work better if you're a certain gender, if you're a woman, the way you save, or the fact that you might be holding a job that's a bit more in the gig economy than necessarily a full-time job in the same way as your partner. And so for us, it's about working with fintechs that help cater to consumers that are excluded in all walks of life. The other quick example I'll give is a fintech called Hi, and with MasterCard, they launched a market first salary access card, which enables people to access their pay as soon as they've earned it. And it works like a regular debit card, but it gives employees direct access to the money they've earned in real time, with a limit in line with their earnings, of course. And so for us, by changing how people are paid using fintech and open banking and open finance technology, Hi sort of puts them directly in charge and gives them greater control of how they pay, for better budgeting, for example, and with the current cost of living crisis, these type of innovations are going to be more important than ever. And so, for us, this is how technology, open banking, open finance innovation can be inclusive by design, and it can really help improve digital financial inclusion as well.
Brilliant. I know you've been doing a lot cross-border and indeed with the World Economic Forum. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about that and some of the principles that you've come up with in this space.
Yeah, so again, this is an area where we think collaboration across with industry, regulators, and also with civil society can really help to make some real impact where it's not currently happening. And we did some work with the World Economic Forum where we helped to develop financial inclusion principles. And these are global, they're not necessarily focused on any particular market. And there's 7 principles. I'll quickly run through them. One of them is that financial services should be inclusive by design. That shouldn't be an add-on. It shouldn't be an afterthought for industry. It should be where industry begins the innovation from. So, when we're designing products and services, that's where we should start from, inclusive. There should also be an integrated system, between policymakers, regulators, and civil society in terms of, when you're developing solutions, you don't look for problems, you do it the other way around. There should also be an element of being digitally led, and so really making use of that digital innovation out there. They should also be economically sustainable. And this is really important because everybody knows, and Janine and others will talk about this during the panel discussion, is that a lot of the groups that are vulnerable and excluded are the ones that have not been seen as economically viable, or as groups that bring a great return on investment for products and services. And so if you make the product economically sustainable, actually you're going to be able to create products and services for customers that might be seen as high risk or seen as not as economically viable. And then informed by data is the 5th principle. Again, a really, really integral part of the open banking, open finance and inclusion conversation. I'll say a bit more about this later on, and we will in the panel as well. And then the 6th principle is trusted, which again, absolutely fundamental to being able to create products and services for more vulnerable consumers. If they can't trust that service or product is going to work for them, then we're starting from the wrong place. And then finally, they need to be effectively regulated. And this is where, for us, things like the FCA having perhaps a financial inclusion consumer duty, the PSR also thinking about under its objective of consumers and end users, making sure the market's working for them, looking at that inclusion piece perhaps in a bit more detail.
Brilliant. I'm sure everybody on the call will agree that they truly are the Magnificent Seven, and we'll be drilling into them more. Finally, for now, what frustrates you the most in this whole arena of financial inclusion?
I think what frustrates us the most is the fact that we're very short term in our thinking in tackling a financial and digital exclusion. We're not thinking even medium or long term, and I'll give you an example. So there is a real growth in flexible workers across the UK and across the world, and the pandemic has definitely pushed some of that growth, and it's going to grow in the next decade as well. But nobody seems to be talking about that. So nobody seems to be talking about what the market of tomorrow will look like, and therefore how open banking, open finance, and the innovation of today, which will then also be the innovation of tomorrow, how that can help the changing market, the changing segments and groups that may be vulnerable and may need support with their financial services, and how we can help them make the most of their income flows, help them to save, help them to budget, give them access to pensions, for example. And again, that's an area that MasterCard, we've been doing some work in other countries, and I think there's a lot of international lessons as well that frustrate me that we need to learn in the UK. And we've developed a couple of payment solutions specifically for gig economy workers with gig economy platforms. And one of them is enabling gig workers to pay and to get paid a bit quicker, but also helping them to save or put money away when they get paid in those months where they're making money. So yeah, that's an example of something that I think we need to do better, is think a bit more medium and long term rather than just in the here and now.